lessons. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the first part of the 20th century. That's the 1900s, from 1900 till about 1950, with a particular focus on the two world wars that took place during that time. Now, that's a long period of time to cover, but I think it's important for us to know about it because it really made our country what it is today. And I think that we're going to go through a lot of stuff, but I also think that a lot of 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds are able to understand more than sometimes people think, and that you guys are going to do a really great job understanding the stuff that we're talking about. So, let's start off by doing a bit of review. In 1905, Canada formed two new provinces. So if you go back and look through your Lesson 8 notes, you should be able to find which two they were. Pause the video and take a look. Good. In 1905, Canada formed two new provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan. And that was because Canada, at the beginning of the 1900s, at the beginning of the 20th century, just so you know, 1900s is 20th century, 1800s is 19th century. It's kind of confusing, but the reason it's that way is that we count it by the last year in the century. So like the 1900s, the last year, that ended with the 2000, right? So the 20th century since Jesus. So in any case, in 1905, Canada formed two new provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, because at the time, the country was growing and people were immigrating and the prairies were being filled up with farms and cities and railways and all that sort of thing. And so it was time to establish two new provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, in what used to be the Northwest Territory. So let's talk about what Canada was like at this time. Canada in 1901, at the 1901 census. So the population of Canada in 1901 was 5,371,315 people. For context, today, the population of Canada is around 36 million. As I speak in 2020, it's around 36 million. The languages that were spoken in Canada were English, French, and Indigenous languages. Most of the population spoke English. A large minority spoke French, and then Indigenous languages were kind of spread throughout the population. For religion, most people were Christian, with a split between Catholic people and Protestants. Most French people were Catholic. Most English people were Protestant, with the exception of the Irish, who were also Catholic. So the long and short of it is that almost everyone at that time would have been Christian. Certain Indigenous people often held their traditional Indigenous beliefs, and many Indigenous people also held those in combination with Christian beliefs. And there were a very, very small number of Jewish and Muslim people at that time. At that time, Canada was primarily still almost completely Christian. In terms of provinces, let's see the provinces that we know about that would have been around in 1901. So let's start off on the west coast that we know best. Let's start off with British Columbia. Now, were Alberta and Saskatchewan provinces in 1901? Nope, they were not. So I'm going to put British Columbia, Manitoba was a province, Ontario was a province, Quebec was a province, New Brunswick was a province, Nova Scotia was a province, Prince Edward Island was a province as well. And I'm going to change this. I encourage you to do it as well. And write, and territories. There were two territories at the time. There was Yukon Territory, where the gold rush had been. And then there was also the Northwest Territories. And the Northwest Territories at this time included a lot of northern Ontario, a lot of northern Quebec, a lot of the prairies, including most of what's now Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, as well as what's today Nunavut and the smaller, what remains of the Northwest Territories. The biggest industries in 1901, so that's the things that people work in, what their jobs are, would have been forestry, farming, fishing, factories, fur trade. The 5 F's of Canada's economy in 1901. You know, people cutting down trees, growing food, catching fish, building things, and trading furs. And the biggest cities in the country would have been Montreal, Quebec, and Toronto, Ontario. So that's what our country looked like in 1901. So Canada kept on growing throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. And now what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to show you a map on the screen, which if we were in class, I'd be printing out for you to kind of look through and investigate. And we did this with the whole class. And if you look at the whole class that were at school, but for anyone who's doing this at home, I'm going to put the link to this map so you can look at it on your own computer in the description of this video. But I'm also going to kind of spend some time going through this map with you together as well. So let's take a look at this map, which I've called that I wanted you to take a look at. And it's not actually one map, it's a collection of 5 maps and a bunch of different graphs that kind of talk about the population and how the population is distributed in Canada across several different periods of time. So what I'm going to invite you to do is we're going to zoom in and we're going to look at this one in the top left-hand corner. And it says British North America, so this is even before Canada, in 1851. And notice how it says 1 dot represents 1,000 inhabitants. That means 1,000 people living there. So if you look at this map of British North America in 1851, you can see that at that time, most of the population of what is today Canada lived in this area from kind of Windsor, Ontario, up to Quebec City, so including Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. Like it's pretty red down here. There's a lot of people who live in the Maritimes, mostly around the edges, around the coast. Some people who live up in Newfoundland. Very few that live in Winnipeg. And of course, there's kind of Indigenous people and other people spread out, because this map is only showing kind of the people that the government was able to count. So we don't know exactly where kind of the Indigenous people would have lived at this point. This could be better almost understood as a map of kind of the people the government was able to count, most of whom would have been kind of European descent. You can see most of Canada at this time is in kind of the east. So this is 1851. Well, let's go ahead to 1871. And by this time, we've got Canada, PEI, and Newfoundland, because in 1867, Confederation happened. And you can see that there has been some expansion, right? Whereas back in 1851, it was, it was dense here. Now it's got way more dense, right? And there's much more of this space is being filled up. And you can see there's a bit of a colony starting in Winnipeg, Manitoba. It's expanding a bit. There's more villages. And you can also see that here in BC, and I'm going to zoom in even further, there's a few red dots. There's a few small red dots, so a few small, population centers in what's currently BC, including the beginning of what later became Vancouver, as well as some other ones along the Fraser River where there was gold rushes. So you can see the country is starting to get bigger. Let's go take a look now at Canada in 1901. So this is 1901, this is kind of the time after which the railway has been built, and they're starting to settle the west. And you can see Manitoba. Well, first off, the east is still where the vast majority of people live, right? Including, again, from this kind of Quebec to Windsor area. But they're starting to expand, right? In the western part of the country, you can see that Winnipeg and Manitoba have got settlements and villages. Same with Saskatchewan, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver. It's starting to get a little bigger. And then by the time we get to 1921, so after all that time of immigration, really this western prairie area is really starting to fill up, as is Vancouver, Victoria, this southern British Columbia area, even Prince Rupert up north. Ontario and Quebec are still where the vast majority of people live. If you kind of go in even closer to this southern Ontario space, it's almost completely covered in red, because by this point, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people live in Ontario and Quebec. Well, in the big cities of Ontario and Quebec. And of course, there's still population growth up here in Newfoundland. I should show you up here, there's these pie charts that show the percentage of the Canadian population that lives in each kind of province. So in 1921, it's 33% Ontario, 33% Ontario, 27% Quebec, BC only 6%, right? So the percentage of the Canadian population is still really heavily weighted towards Ontario and Quebec at this time. And this is what? This year is 1921. So then let's go down and let's take a look at Canada in 1941. So this is during the Second World War, after even more kind of immigration. And you can see the same kind of pattern, right? Southern Ontario and southern Quebec are still pretty full. The Maritimes are very full right around the edges, particularly around the coast, because most of those people lived fishing lives. You can see their population has spread out across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. You might wonder, why is it so thick down here and so thinly spread down here? Well, one of the reasons for that is that most of the people who lived out here lived on kind of bigger farms. And most of the people who live in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal live in smaller places, more like cities, right? And kind of the same deal in BC, where it's mostly mountains, is that most of the people live in a really kind of like crammed in area around Vancouver and Victoria, whereas most of BC is still pretty much empty of kind of white European / Euro-Canadian settlement. And at that point, and the contemporary, like the map of Canada that as it exists today, doesn't look all that different from this map, to be honest. Like most of the people in the country still live in this Quebec to Windsor area. Ontario and Quebec are still the biggest provinces. You would say it's probably more filled in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And you know, Vancouver is a much bigger city than it would have been at that time. Now let's take a look at the questions that I asked you to answer from this map and see if we can find the information on them. So what was the population of Canada in 1901? Well, let's see if we can find it. So I'm going to zoom out. I want to direct your attention down here to where they have these 3 graphs. So this graph says changes in the numerical distribution of the population of Canada. So here, it's talking about Canada. So this is the population of Canada. And so it's like, what was the population of Canada in 1901? Well, note how on this axis it says population in millions. Well, if we look down here, it says 1900. And if I go up to the line marking Canada, in 1901, the population of Canada was about 5.5 million. So about 5.5 million. So you could write that down in euros, about 5.5 million. And I would use that squiggly line to represent how it's approximate. And then I'm going to go now over to 1921, and I'm going to go up. And by 1921, so only 20 years later, it's about 8.5 million. So it hasn't quite doubled, but it certainly increased really fast over 20 years. And you can see that by the way that the line in this line graph is going, right? It's like, woo, the population is increasing. Yeah. So those are the answers to the first 2 questions, right? You've got about 5.5 million, and now you have about 8.5 million. Okay. Okay, let's go back and take a look at what the other questions you have to answer. What percent of the population lived in BC in 1901? What percentage lived in BC in 1921? Well, what did it say up in these circle graphs? So let's go up to 1901. It's 1851, 1871, 1901. So in 1901, in BC, the percent of the population of Canada's population that lived in BC was 3.3%. So you can write on that line 3.3%. And if we go ahead to 1921, the percent is 6%. So it's almost doubled, not quite, but almost doubled as a percent of the Canadian population that lives in BC. So that means that out of 100 Canadians, 6 of them would have lived in British Columbia, 6%. And let's take a look at population of Vancouver, our city in 1901, and population of Vancouver in 1941. So if we look back and we look at 1901, in the bottom left-hand corner of the maps, it shows the population of various cities at different times. So Montreal, that in 1901 was about 267,000. Toronto was about 210,000, if I'm rounding. And Vancouver was 27,010. So in 1901, the population of Vancouver was 27,010. And let's see, if we go down to the population of Vancouver in 1941, Metro Vancouver, by that point, was 351,491. So over 40 years, it went from about 30,000 to about 350,000. So if you're doing some quick math in your head, 30 to 350 is, if you were to multiply 30 by 11, the population of Vancouver over 40 years increased 11 times, which is wild, right? That's huge, the population growth in that period of time. So I just wanted to show you this map just to give you some indication of kind of how our population has changed in this part of the 20th century. And the key message you need to remember is just that the population started to increase and provinces in the West started to become more important because more people moved there. And today, still, most Canadians live in Ontario and Quebec, but the West is an important part of Confederation as well. So we'll pause there and we'll start going on to the next part of a bit about how Canada's population was growing. Let's talk about one of the really more shameful aspects of our country's history. This that became really important, has been important throughout, but took place a lot during this early 1900s period. So by 1900, most Indigenous peoples in Canada still lived in rural and remote communities, including on reserves. And when I say rural and remote, I mean they're far away from the big cities. They are, places like Prince Rupert, places like Nunavut, places like northern BC, and of course there's Indigenous people near our big cities, like for example Musqueam, in and around Vancouver, but most Indigenous people still lived far away from kind of the bigger population sites. During the settlement of the West, the federal government began trying to assimilate Indigenous people into white settler society. And assimilate means that they wanted to make it so that Indigenous people were not different than any other Canadian with a kind of European background. So they wanted them to speak French or English, to become Catholic or Protestant, to send their kids to a regular kind of school, to become farmers or workers in one of the trades, to leave behind the things that made them unique. So the government did a few different things to try and make this happen, to try to assimilate Indigenous people. The first one was residential schools. And residential means that you would live there. So it was a boarding school. So these were boarding schools where Indigenous children were taken to learn to read and write English or French and forced to adopt European customs and forget their own family and culture. Many of these schools were run by the churches, who thought it would be a good way to convert Indigenous people. Many of the 150,000 people who attended these schools were abused. Many of them were not treated well, were not treated fairly, were hit by their teachers and all that kind of thing. So I'll show you a picture here of Thomas Moore Kiesek, and he's a Saulteaux boy from Saskatchewan. And this is a picture of him before and after he attended the residential school. So you can see on the left, he's dressed up in kind of his tribal regalia, and on the right, he's being converted into just kind of another European-looking kid with a slightly darker skin complexion. And so 150,000 children attended these schools over a period that lasted from the late 1800s till quite late into the 1900s. And the point of it was to try and take children away from their families and make them into basically white Canadians like anyone else. And we now look back on that and we say that that was a terrible, terrible mistake that our country made. Another thing the government did was they banned Indigenous cultural practices. So that's kind of different traditions. So the potlatch was an important coastal Indigenous tradition that the government banned. And the Sundance was an important Plains Indigenous tradition that the government discouraged as well. So the government didn't want at this time people celebrating non-European, non-white kind of ceremonies because they wanted everybody to assimilate and to become just like any other Canadian. And another big one would have been kind of changes from traditional Indigenous ways of life. So many nomadic people, so those are people who would move around rather, were forced to live on small reserves where they were told to farm instead of hunting or fishing. This was a new way of life to them, and many people struggled to transition. So I've taken here two photos of different reserves in Canada, and the one on the left is up in the Arctic, where people would have lived in igloos and kind of moved around and hunted. And instead the government said, no, we want you to live in these kind of like European-style houses and not to do so much hunting anymore. And then in other places, like on the coast or in the plains, the government said, no, we don't want you traveling around as much. We want you settling in one place, on one reserve, on a small place, which was difficult for many people and which was unfair to many people. Now today, many Indigenous people are trying to rebuild their cultures and families, which were hurt by the government's policy to assimilate Indigenous peoples. And if you look on the right, you may have seen these before. These are the different kind of letters of the Musqueam alphabet for their language, Hunkaminam. And the point is that many of the Musqueam grandparents and great-grandparents would have been sent to a residential school where they would have lost the ability to speak their language. So not that many people still speak it. And the goal of Musqueam today is to try and revitalize their language, to teach their children that language so that they'll be able to speak it and that you can maintain that culture going forward. And so it's really important. And if you go down to Musqueam today, you'll see that on the stop signs, for example, it no longer says stop in English, it says stop in the Hunkaminam language. At UBC, they have street signs that are in Hunkaminam. So many Indigenous people are trying to rebuild their culture and families at this point. And I think another thing that kind of has happened is that the rest of Canada, so non-Indigenous Canadians, have begun to realize that, there was some real unfairness there. So I'm going to show you this 2-minute clip of the Prime Minister before our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, So this prime minister was named Stephen Harper, and he was from the other political party, the Conservatives, and he got up and delivered on behalf of Canada an apology to Indigenous Canadians for the residential schools.
I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. The Government of Canada built an educational system in which very young children were often forcibly removed from their homes, often taken far from their communities. Many were inadequately fed, clothed, and housed. All were deprived of the care and nurturing of their parents, grandparents, and communities. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages and cultural practices were prohibited in these schools. Tragically, some of these children died while attending residential schools, and others never returned home. The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative.
So that is kind of a speech given by the Prime Minister where he apologized on behalf of the country for this policy that had taken place. And so it kind of is an important thing to remember that, you know, despite the fact that many of us will think that we have a really great country, that, you know, with greatness also comes shame and bad things, right? That there's good and bad in everything. And that it's important to kind of learn from the mistakes that our country has made and to try and move forward in a better way. I'm now going to shift gears a little bit and talk to you about World War I. So, even though it was independent, the Dominion of Canada was still part of the British Empire, which meant the British government controlled our defense and relations with other countries. So in this image here, you can see this is a map of the British Empire, and all the countries in pink are parts of the British Empire at about 1900. So you can see, of course, Britain and Ireland right here in the center that I'm circling right now. But you can also see India, you can see Australia, you can see New Zealand, you can see South Africa, you can see Ghana and Nigeria, you can see British Guyana, you can see, they're kind of harder to see, but like Jamaica and other countries here, and then of course the Dominion of Canada. And if you look up here, it says freedom, fraternity, which means brotherhood, and federation. And they're also talking about, you can see it says world, and you've got this image of this British woman with her trident. And the trident is a symbol of the sea, because one of the reasons that Britain was so powerful was that they were a seagoing nation. They had a great navy. They had all sorts of ships, and they were very strong on the oceans. And if you look at the different pictures around the edges, you can kind of show what they're trying to portray is that this is an empire that includes many different kinds of people from all over the world. You have an indigenous man, you have a Chinese woman, because of course at this point Hong Kong was run by the British, and then you have African women, you have over here an Indian man on an elephant. So you have all these different people. And the point of this map, you know, the perspective of it is of a British person who thinks that they, you know, that their empire is a good thing, that they ought to be ruling kind of the world. And many of the people in the different colonies would have disagreed, but others might have agreed. You know, most Canadians at this time would have been proud to be part of the British Empire, particularly most English Canadians. So in any case, back in Europe, there were tensions between many of the important great powers. So these were the countries with large empires and many colonies around the world. Because it wasn't just Britain that had an empire. The French had an empire, the Germans had an empire, you know, the Spanish kind of had an empire. So many different countries had a role around the world. By 1914, there were two main alliances of countries that promised to defend each other if they or their colonies were attacked. And so on your sheet, you should see that you have a map that looks something like this. And what I'd like you to do on the side is I'd like you to create a legend. And in that legend, I'd like you to mark three different kind of groups. One of them, you're going to mark the Triple Alliance. The other, you're going to mark the Triple Entente, and that's spelled E-N-T-E-N-T-E. And then the other one, you're going to call neutral. And once you've done that, we're going to start coloring in these different countries and showing you where they were in the different kind of alliances in Europe at this time. So you have the three red countries here, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, were the Triple Alliance. And so you can color those in red. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. You might be saying, hey, wait, Austria-Hungary isn't a country anymore. It isn't. Austria is a country and Hungary is a country, but the kind of combined one is no longer a country. And you might notice that Poland and Ukraine aren't on this map because at that time they weren't countries either. Or Ireland was part of Great Britain at this time. And then you'll color in a different color the Triple Entente, which is Great Britain, France, and Russia. And they were another alliance of different countries that promised to defend each other. And then all these countries colored in green were neutral countries. But because Canada was still part of the British Empire, we were still part of this kind of Triple Entente. Even though we were thousands and thousands of kilometers away, and most Canadians had never seen Britain, we were still part of this alliance of countries in what was soon going to be the world's biggest war. So in the summer of 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated. And if you assassinate someone, then you kill them, which set off this chain reaction of different events. And soon, Russia, France, and Great Britain were at war with Germany and Austro-Hungary. Germany quickly invaded Belgium. So if you look at this map, here's Germany. They're trying to attack France, so they go like, and they go through Belgium to attack France. And France set up these trenches, and we talked about trenches earlier this year on Remembrance Day. They're these deep, long holes where a soldier can kind of hide to fight off the other guys. Now, Canada was part of the British Empire, so it was automatically at war when Britain entered the war. The Canadian government immediately began to recruit men to go fight in the European battles with our British and French allies. So here's a newspaper item from that day when it says, "Assassination may lead to war. Austrian Archduke is killed. Believe that empire will die. Gigantic murder plot is feared." And then shortly thereafter, posters like this one were in the streets of Canada. Here's your chance. It's men we want. To the women of Canada, you have read what the Germans have done in Belgium. Have you thought what they would do if they invaded this country? Do you realize that the safety of your home and children depends on getting more men now? Do you realize that the word go from you may send another man to fight for our king and country? When the war is over and someone asks your husband and your son what he did in the Great War, is he to hang his head because you would not let him go? Won't you help and send a man to enlist today? And then this is your flag. It stands for liberty. Fight for it. Join the Overseas Battalion. Apply, base, recruiting office, Spark Street, Ottawa. So there were these signs everywhere saying, we need guys to sign up for the army to go fight in these battles in Europe. So over the course of the war, 600,000 Canadian men fought in the war, as well as about 2,800 Canadian women nurses who served as well on the front lines. Now, most of the fighting took place in trenches, which are these deep holes where you can take cover from enemy gunfire. The fighting was brutal. It was absolutely terrible, and over 60,000 Canadian men died. This war also saw the first uses of poison gas, tanks, and airplanes, and the last major use of horses in warfare. When I say 60,000 Canadian men died, you've got to think that is a huge number of people. That's like the entire population of small towns in Canada today. Like, it's a huge number of people died in this absolutely terrible war. So if you look at this image, this is an image of a Canadian soldier as he looks through a bombed building in Ypres, Belgium, in November 1917. And you can see these churches just absolutely destroyed as the Germans and the French and the British and the Canadians send different shells, which are these bombs that explode on each other. And it destroyed these cities, it destroyed these towns, and it was profoundly violent and destructive of life. So I'm going to show you this image, this video here of some Canadian soldiers as they are fighting in this First World War. I think I might just expand it a little bit so you can see it better. I should say this is kind of a gory video, so if you're a little scared by that, then you may want to skip ahead a minute.
Stay down, Hall! There's nothing you can do for him, you hear me? I gotta get him soon as he's alive! Come back! Come back, you fool! He's got him! He's bringing him back!
Sergeant Fred Hall lived on Winnipeg's Pine Street. Rob Shanklin lived on Pine Street too. And you know what? So did Leo Clark.
And no!
Sergeant! Sergeant! It's Clark! We just heard he took out 20 Germans! Clark?
Clark, Shanklin, Hall. Amazingly, they all won the highest award for courage we could give them, the Victoria Cross. That's why we changed the name of Pine Street to Valor Road.
So you can see kind of the sort of thing that the men were fighting in, right? These terrible trenches, and how dangerous it was to fight in those. And in that case, you've got these three men who are so heroic and who just happen to have grown up on the same street in Winnipeg, which was renamed from Pine Street to Valor Road. Valor meaning courage. And here's kind of a picture of kind of what some of the Canadian women who were sent over there, those 2,800 women, were doing during this war in the First World War.
Dear Mother, I am no stranger to suffering, but nothing could have prepared me for this. The boys come to us mangled and blinded, and so often there is little we can do. If this war doesn't end soon, there won't be a man living on the face of the earth. But don't worry, we nurses continue. I continue. I'm glad I came, but I think very often how good it will be when it's all over, and I'm returning to all I love most, home.
Eleanor Thompson was awarded the Military Medal for her bravery that night. Eden Pringle was killed in action. They were two of the nearly 3,000 Canadian nursing sisters during the First World War.
So usually Canadians fought with the British, but we fought independently during this important battle called the Battle of Vimy Ridge in France. And this is now where you can see Canada's War Memorial is located. So in France, if you go there, there is, in northern France, this picture of the War Memorial, and it looks like you've got these angels kind of, and these mothers kind of weeping for their sons, because at that War Memorial, at that same place, you know, if you were to go there back, what I guess almost a little more than 100 years ago, this is where many Canadians would have died. And actually, you know how there are the two different versions of Canada's national anthem, where it used to say, "In all thy sons command," and now it says, "Thou doth in us command." Well, it was changed to "In all thy sons command," originally because of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, because so many young men were killed in that. And so they say, "In all thy sons command." But it's recently been changed back to the original. In any case, in 1917, Canada was deciding on conscription, which we talked about last week, which would force all men to sign up for the army in the election. Sir Robert Borden, the Conservative Prime Minister, gave women the right to vote for the first time in order to increase the chance he would win. So there was kind of this debate, should you force all men to sign up for the army? And the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Borden, said, well, what we should do is let's give the right to vote to their wives and their mothers and their sisters, and then they'll vote for me and my policy of conscription because they will want us to be sending over more men to the front to help their relatives. So if you look at this campaign poster, it says, "The Canadian Mother, goodbye and God bless you, my boy. While you are away, I will do my duty and cast my ballot for the Union government, which will stand by you. "You shall not be deserted." So that poster was trying to say that these women, these mothers, are going to vote for the Union government in order to have conscription go through. So shortly thereafter, in 1918, Germany surrendered and signed an armistice, which is like a peace treaty, on November 11th. And this is why we celebrate Remembrance Day, right? So Remembrance Day remembers the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which is the day on which the war formally ended because Germany had surrendered. And one of the things that we do almost every Remembrance Day is we read a poem written by one of Canada's greatest poets, John McCrae, which was written during the First World War, where he was serving as a doctor.
Cigarette, sir. Bless you. Major John McCrae, surgeon, born and raised in Guelph, Ontario. Poppies. No. Blow. Between crosses. If ye break faith, shall not sleep.
Right?
In Flanders fields.
What is it?
I'm not sure. John McCrae of Montreal died in the war, but his poem is still spoken aloud when men, women, and children gather to remember.
And one of the reasons that he was talking about poppies is because poppies are one of the few flowers that grow really well, when you have disturbed soil, when the soil is kind of all messed up. And the soil was messed up because of all the bombing. And so the only plant that would grow really well were the poppies. And they would grow near these grave sites that they had set up for the men who passed away in Europe. Now, after the war, Canada had a booming economy in the 1920s. People could enjoy goods such as electricity, telegraphs, radio, and indoor plumbing, which were changing life for regular people. In 1903, the Wright brothers' first flight took place in North Carolina, USA. After World War I, flying became a more common mode of transport, though it didn't really take off until after World War II. And this is an image of one of the first flights of the Wright brothers, where they were trying to figure out how to get themselves moving. And one thing you might notice is that, wait, they're filming this? So by around this time, they were, in 1903, the early 1900s, they were finally able to actually film things. They'd figured out the technology for how to do that. And this is them filming one of the very first flights. And the wild thing about it is that they're showing the way in which there's kind of two different technologies here, right, that are changing, that are advancing. One of them is flight, and the other is the actual way that you're seeing it, which is a video. So it's been a long time from the Wright brothers and this British Pathé film to where we are today, where you're watching this on YouTube and people can fly around the world kind of overnight. But in 1929, there was an economic crash on Wall Street in New York that started the worldwide Great Depression. Millions of people around the world lost their jobs, including hundreds of thousands of Canadians. The unemployment rate was at 33% of the working-age male workforce in 1935. This meant that 1 in 3 men was out of work, a disaster for their families. These people often became homeless or traveled the railways looking for work. And so you started to have things like this, like a soup kitchen, where people would line up because they had no money, and so they had no food for their families. So you've got the World War I, followed by a booming economy, followed by a crash, and people can no longer feed themselves and feed their families. And of course, in there, you also had the Spanish flu, which we don't often talk about, but right after World War I, there was kind of a mini version of this coronavirus pandemic, except at the time, people were not really knowledgeable about how these flus worked and how they spread. And so millions of people around the world died of this Spanish flu right after World War I and right before the boom followed by the bust, where there was the Great Depression. So it was a really kind of crazy time for a lot of different people. So you can see free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed, and this giant kind of line of people lined up for it. Now, after the Depression, many people began to think that the government should do more to help the poor and they started to support creating what we call a social safety net to help people survive. And the idea is that if you lose your job and you can't afford anything anymore, that the rest of society is going to catch you in a safety net so that you don't starve on the street. And you can see this child protesting where it says, "Why can't you give my dad a job?" Right? And a really good example of this in Canada is our healthcare system. And this is kind of a video that shows a little bit of how our healthcare system started off, where you get healthcare that's free. You pay for it through your taxes, but it's free when you go to the hospital if you need it.
They'll find them. We'll find you someplace.
And Laura wouldn't have died if this community could agree on a real hospital. If we can forget our differences.
Я можу дозволити $50.
Ми будували найліпшу стайну.
То ми збудуємо шпиталь? Ну, так. Добре.
Our community did get together and build a real hospital with free services. Maybe we started something.
So you have at this time kind of the development of what I call that social safety net, which we still have today, right? You can go to school for free. You can also, it's not free, you pay for it through your taxes, but you can also go to the hospital for free, and again, for free is the wrong word. You pay for it through your taxes, but the idea there is that if somebody gets sick, that they don't go bankrupt, which is something that still happens in places like the United States. But would you believe it, right after the Great Depression, things in Europe got crazy again, and Canada got back involved. So the Great Depression was bad in Canada, but it was also bad in Europe. This contributed to many tensions in countries around Europe, and threats of a new war. In Russia, the Communist Party had taken control, and they were oppressing the people. They renamed the country the Soviet Union. They believed, and by that I mean the communists, that the state should own all things and control the entire economy for the benefit of the workers. They hated the rich and anyone with traditional values. They were willing to kill anyone who stood in their way, especially the royals, so the royal family of Russia, church leaders, and wealthy people. And so here's a guy named Lenin, and he was the kind of first communist to take over Russia. And this is a flag of what they proposed and created for the Soviet Union, which came after Russia. And then you can see here that they promised, we're going to have this beautiful land filled with milk and honey and grain, and it's going to be wonderful. And here is an image of people who are starving on the street because, their policies did not really work out. And it led to a lot of kind of heartache and pain for a lot of people. And similarly, in Germany, you've got Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party. The National Socialist Party rose to power by blaming Jews and other minorities for the problems that Germany faced. After he gained power, Hitler canceled the elections and he banned political parties. He started arresting his opponents and killing him. So this is Hitler, and he's speaking. And one of the things that they started to do is they started to say, it's not our fault that, Germany's doing badly. It's the Jews' fault. And the Jews were a religious minority. And so he kind of shut down German democracy and he started going after the Jews. And in Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist party took over. He created a police state where the police and the army ran the country without a democracy. So here you have Mussolini, and would you believe it, he was friends with Hitler because their two ideas were very similar. So Canada's British allies had decided to try to appease the leaders because they did not want another war. This meant they would not stop their abuses if they would keep the peace. At the same time, the Nazis began a campaign of killing millions of their own people in concentration camps across Germany. They killed 6 million Jewish people, political opponents, people with disabilities, Roma people, and gay people. This is called the Holocaust, and it was later called a genocide. That means it was an attempt to kill an entire people, like an entire nation. And of course, this is one of the worst things that's ever happened in human history. And the British, the leaders in Britain said, well, we don't really know what's happening and it might be very difficult to stop. And in fairness, we had just been through World War I, which was absolutely terrible. So they didn't want it to happen again. And so what they said is, we're going to just kind of try and appease them and prevent another war from happening. So if you look at this photo, you can see these children and their mothers and their fathers walking along, and they have these little stars affixed to them. And the stars say Jude, and that means Jew. And they say that in German. And the idea was that if you were Jewish, you would have to wear one of these stars on your body. And then if you wore that star, people could treat you unfairly. In any case, in 1939, Nazi Germany attacked Poland, which was a country in Eastern Europe. And France and Britain declared war to defend their Polish allies. And Canada declared war 1 week later. In Britain, the Conservative Prime Minister Winston Churchill rose to power, promising to stop appeasing Germany and start defeating it. And I'm going to play now for you a radio clip of what was happening on the CBC at this time. So the CBC is, Canada's national broadcaster, and they've been around for a very long time. And so back in the 1930s, in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, they were going to show everyone kind of what that was. So they would rebroadcast from the BBC, the British broadcast.
Details will be given later in this news. Germany has invaded Poland and has bombed many towns. General mobilization has been ordered in Britain and France. Parliament was summoned for 6 o'clock this evening. Orders completing the mobilization of the Navy, Army and Air Force were signed by the King at a meeting this afternoon of the Privy Council. Details will be given later in this news. The British Cabinet met from 11:30 this morning until...
So you get the idea, right? The idea is that you've got what's going on is that the Nazi Germans have invaded and they have started to take over Poland, and they've started what eventually becomes then the Second World War. Started to recruit more Canadian soldiers to go to Britain and help to defend it from Nazi German attacks. At first, Germany was winning the war, as it quickly conquered France. Only Britain and its allies stood against the Germans. Canada was one of those main allies, and we fought in a bunch of different battles. One of them was the Battle of Britain. This was an air battle between the Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe. The goal of the Germans was to bomb British cities, while the British and the Canadians wanted to shoot German planes out of the sky. So the idea was that Britain is an island, right? So it's not connected to France. So you have to, if you're going to go into it to take over, you're going to have to invade it. So you're going to have to take in boats and all that. And the idea was that you could start to really hurt the morale, hurt the feelings, and kind of soften up the British by bombing their cities. So the Germans went in and they would bomb city after city after city in London. And then the Royal Air Force, including the Canadians who went over there to fly on its behalf, their goal was to shoot down the bombers before they could bomb British cities. And if you remember, we read earlier this year, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, why those children were out in the countryside. It's because at that time, thousands of British children were sent to the countryside, and even some of them across to Canada, so that they could remain safe during the time that the Germans were bombing Britain.
Hitler starts the battle for Britain as usual on women and children. From many areas it's the same story. Military objectives missed. Bombs and destruction on homes and schools. In these first raids, our home defenses have given a magnificent account of themselves. Here is one of the Nazi planes that will never return. Drums of bullets that now will never be used against us. Once again, the swastika has been shot through and through. But for every one we destroyed, there were others to carry on their deadly work.
So you get the idea, which is just that at this time, the Germans were attacking Britain itself at home. And there is kind of a famous person who is important to Canadian and British history and just the World War II. So you've got, in this clip, there's an actor who portrays Sir Winston Churchill, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, and he's discussing the dangers that the Nazis posed to Britain in 1940. And even though it's an actor, this is a real speech, so he's quoting exactly what was said, and it was delivered in the British Parliament. It's kind of a really famous one, so I'm going to share part of it with you guys right now.
Our evacuations, our thankfulness at the escape of our army, and so many men whose loved ones have passed through an agonizing week, must not blind us to the fact that what has happened in France and Belgium is a colossal military disaster. We are told that Herr Hitler has a plan for invading the British Isles. This has often been thought of before. I have myself full confidence that all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and the best arrangements are made as they are being made. We shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island homes, to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary, alone. Even though large tracts of Europe, many old and famous states, have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
So you can see why that speech would have been so inspirational to the people of Britain at that time, to say that we're never going to surrender to these Nazis, and people in Canada would have listened to it as well, just on the radio, right, which is a relatively new technology that really started to impact the way people would listen to things. So we'll go on to talk about, so here's a fighter pilot. His name was Andrew Minarski, and he was a Canadian, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the highest military kind of award that we have in Canada, to save a fellow member of the Royal Canadian Air Force. It is given to soldiers who demonstrate extreme courage, heroism, and self-sacrifice.
You tail gunners! Minarski, Brophy, get some sleep. We have a mission in exactly 6 hours.
Good night, sir.
I can't hold it, man! Everybody bail now! Slow your smash! Get a damn big jam! Minarski, jump! That's an order! I gotta get Brophy clear! Jump, for God's sake, before it explodes! Good night. Sir, tail gunner Brophy, trapped in his turret, miraculously survived the crash, to tell of the heroism of Andrew Minarski, VC, who died of his burns.
Another important battle that the Canadians participated was the Battle of Hong Kong. And you might wonder, wait, why are they in a battle in Hong Kong? I thought the World War II was happening in Europe. Well, actually, it was happening all over, right? And one of the places it was happening was the Japanese were the allies of Germany. And the Japanese at this time, the Japanese Empire, believed that it was superior to all the other Asian countries. And so Hong Kong was under attack by the Japanese Empire. And Hong Kong was a British colony in China at that time. So Canadians, as part of the British Empire, were fighting.
Listen, they never sent us any bloody jeeps, never mind artillery. No, the Japs. The Japs are all over us. We're going outside now before they burn the place down.
Come on, lads! Oswald, give us a cover!
Sir!
He's down, sir! Lawson's down! So's Hennessy!
All right, fix bayonets! We move out of my orders!
Oh my god, grenade! Grenade!
Our troops in Hong Kong were the first Canadians to see combat in the Second World War, and the war's first Victoria Cross for Canada was awarded posthumously to Sergeant Major John Osborne of Winnipeg.
And of course, while this is happening back at home in Canada, Japanese Canadians were being treated very unfairly, because even though they were of Japanese background, they were Canadians, and so they should have been treated more fairly. But Canadians were seeing battle overseas in Asia, including in Hong Kong. Another big campaign we were involved in was called the Atlantic Campaign, and this was an effort by the German U-boats, which were their submarines, to prevent Canadian and American ships from reaching Britain by sinking ships in the Atlantic Ocean. The Royal Canadian Navy worked to sink German submarines and keep supplies going. So in 1941, the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, and the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. This meant that the Soviets and the Americans joined the war on Britain and Canada's side. And we fought in two other ones called the Italian Campaign. So by 1943, the war was starting to change course. The Allies, so our side, was starting to win. Canadians landed in southern Italy, and they marched north, liberating Italy from the fascists as they went. And the D-Day landing at Juno Beach. In 1944, it was finally time to attack France and free it from the Germans. Together with the United States and Britain, Canadians landed in Juno Beach, France, and fought for control of the beach. Once we controlled the beach, more soldiers could land and continue invading.
Now do that break. Come on, Ralph.
This is the BBC. Here is the news. Dauntless Canadian troops beat back hitherto invincible German forces on Normandy's Juno Beach today.
And this is Canadian Armed Forces Radio, with something that really matters. That great, great hit by Toronto's own Ruth Lowe. Listen to this.
Play it again, Johnny.
Musician and broadcaster Johnny Lombardi would continue to play a prominent role in our popular culture for another half-century.
Double time!
But not before he and the men of the 7th Canadian Infantry had earned the world's gratitude for what they did at Juno Beach.
So I show you that one just to kind of make the point that these people are not, crazy warriors who are super different than us. They're ordinary Canadians, right? Ordinary Canadian men who were called to do something extraordinary and fight to defend our country and kind of also freedom in this time that was really a wild time in our history. And it wasn't just ordinary Canadian men. There were women, too, who were caught up in the war, Canadian women who were caught up in the war, including this woman who was a diplomat. That means she worked to try and negotiate peace overseas.
No. I'm telling you, I was in a German prison camp for 4 years.
What's going on here, Sergeant?
Claims she's a Canadian, sir, but she could be a German spy. What's your name, lady?
Mona Parsons.
Mona Parsons? From Wolfville. It's me, Harry Foster. Gosh, what happened to you?
I was in the resistance. The Gestapo got me.
Darauf besteht die Todesstrafe durch Erschießen.
Meine Herren, guten Morgen.
Dear lady, you have great courage. I recommend you appeal the sentence.
Living in Holland during the war, Mona Parsons had helped downed Allied airmen get back to Britain.
You will escape.
And she did escape. And back in Nova Scotia after the war, she married General Harry Foster.
So isn't that a wonderful story that this woman who, she fought against the Nazis in Holland ended up marrying one of the Canadian soldiers that she met after the Canadians liberated Holland after the Second World War. So in 1945, the Allies won the war and Germany surrendered. A few months later, the Americans dropped atomic bombs, nuclear weapons, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. Those killed 120,000 Japanese civilians, and it forced the Japanese to surrender. The Second World War was over. So if you look here at this image, this is an image of the city of Nagasaki in Japan after the Americans dropped the atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb was this terrible weapon that killed thousands and thousands and more than 100,000, not soldiers, but ordinary citizens. And many people to this day still debate whether it was a good and fair thing for the Americans to have dropped that weapon on the Japanese. So in 1945, the US president demanded that Japan surrender in order to save itself from destruction. But the Japanese leaders refused. President Truman, the American president, then ordered the bombing of 2 Japanese cities.
There can be no peace in the world until the military power of Japan is destroyed.
So in that video, it was kind of a video released to the Japanese government, and it was sent over American airwaves, and it basically said that unless you surrender, we are going to bomb you. And the Japanese leaders said, nope, bomb us. But there's still an ongoing debate about whether that was the right thing to do. So a question I have that you can just think about a little bit is, were the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings moral? And these were bombings that basically focused on just bombing the city of. So here are the arguments for that people will sometimes give. So these bombs probably ended the war earlier and faster. It may have prevented even more deaths because the Americans did not have to invade Japan by land. 3, if the Japanese Empire did not surrender unconditionally, then it may have continued its aggressive behavior in Asia over the next generation. So one of the things that Truman was thinking of was that the Japanese had been they had invaded China, they had invaded Taiwan, they had invaded Korea. They had been really kind of terrible. And the thought was that if we don't stop them now, then they might continue to do terrible things after the war. And then the last one is that the Japanese Empire had committed war crimes in China and against the Allied prisoners during the war. So they might have even been more brutal during an invasion. So the Americans, if they didn't bomb them, were going to have to land on the Japanese islands and kind of send their troops through. Here are the arguments against. So they did not target soldiers, these bombings. They targeted civilians. That means men, women, and children who are not fighting. The argument against always says it is always wrong to kill people except in self-defense. The third argument is that the Japanese may have surrendered anyways. Some people will say, well, why didn't they just bomb a mountain or something to show how powerful their weapons were? And the effects of nuclear bombings last through the generations. There are people in Japan who still have higher rates of cancer and birth defects because of the atomic bomb. These terrible weapons can explode an entire city, and they poison the area for decades afterwards. And so we'll watch this video about this. It tells the story of a woman who was just a child in Nagasaki at the time of the atomic bomb. She was, 14 years old.
When I was young, I lived in the town of Saka near Hiroshima with my mother, father, brothers, and sisters. Our house was right by the ocean. I enjoyed watching the sunset, picking flowers, and exploring the village. Sometimes I would climb to the top of trees so I could see the beautiful ocean glittering in the sunshine. My best friend Hitoshi would wait for me under the tree, and we would spend hours chatting about our hopes for the future. I liked him a lot, so when he told me he wanted to be a writer when he grew up, I replied, I will be a poet then. The morning of the bomb was just like any other.
I remember Mom was at home and I was getting ready to walk to work at Ministry of Communications in Hiroshima. Because so many young men were away fighting in the war, there weren't enough people to do all the jobs. So children like me were made to leave school and go to work instead. I was standing by a window on the third floor when I saw a powerful flash. I thought the sun had fallen down in front of my eyes. In a split second, I saw rainbow-colored rays everywhere. That was the moment the bomb exploded. I must have lost consciousness because when I woke up, I wasn't by the window and I realized I hurt my head. Somehow I got up and started heading outside. A woman helped me walk to the hospital. Our city was completely destroyed, and on the way I noticed how there were no buildings, no cats or dogs, even birds or butterflies. There were just people wandering around in a daze, covered in ash. At some point the next day, I woke up. I really missed my mom, so I headed across town. But fires were still burning all around, so I had to be careful. Close to home, I saw 3 people approaching me. "Is that really you?" one of them screamed. It was my mother, my older sister, and my aunt. Sadly, my brother didn't make it. He was badly hurt and died. It all seemed like a dream. I just couldn't understand what had happened. I left Hiroshima in my 20s. For years, I couldn't even talk about the bomb, but my family persuaded me to share my story. Then I became a poet just like I discussed all those years ago with Hitoshi. I never dreamed it would actually happen. Because of the radiation from the bomb, I've suffered many health problems like bad headaches and tiredness. But doctors in Tokyo have been looking after me. I got married and I have 3 sons of my own. I also have 4 grandchildren. I speak to them as much as I can. Despite everything, I don't hate the people who dropped the bomb. I can say I was able to witness how wonderful humans can be after losing everything. But I will never forgive the fact that humans dropped an atomic bomb on other humans.
So I show you that grade 5 just because I think that it's important to realize that the people that are in these wars are not just people who lived a long time ago and had lives very different than us, but they're people, right? And that war is an absolutely terrible thing. You know, it's not something to be celebrated or happy about, even as we want to recognize the fact that many of the Canadians and other people who fought, you know, in the Second World War were heroes, that they were standing up for freedom and for democracy and for human rights. After the war was over, Canada focused on winning the peace. And what that means is that we participated in founding an organization called the United Nations, which would seek to solve future problems peacefully by debating them instead of fighting over them. And you can see here there's this kind of map of the world, and then around it there's the olive branches, which are a traditional sign going back to the story of Noah's Ark, the idea of peace. Now, one of the first actions of the United Nations was to agree on a statement that they called the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which set out the basic idea that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed, they are given with reason and conscience, and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. The leaders of every nation agreed to this idea, even though almost every country still fails to live up to it. So basically the entire world signed what you might call a treaty or an agreement or a deal, or just a declaration of kind of what we generally believed about human beings. And we'll play a little video for you about that one, because I think it's important to understand kind of what human rights are.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin?
After World War II, it was clear that the horrors of the war should never be allowed to occur again. Founded in 1945, the United Nations sought to prevent future atrocities by affirming, in its foundational charter, faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, and a commitment to promote better standards of life in larger freedom. In the years that followed, member states of the United Nations strived to develop the human rights provisions of the Charter and capture them in a single document. It took 3 years to agree on a common vision. On the 10th of December, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations.
Still, it is the first step in a great evolutionary process. It is the first occasion on which the organized community of nations has made a declaration of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it has the authority of the body of opinion of the United Nations as a whole. And millions of people, men and women and children all over the world, will turn for hope and guidance and inspiration to this document.
While history alone can determine the historic significance of an event, it is safe to say that the declaration before us may be destined to occupy an honorable place in the procession of positive landmarks in human history.
The declaration consists of a preamble and 30 articles, with Article 1 powerfully proclaiming that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. No discrimination, right to life, liberty and security, no slavery, no torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, equal protection of the law, no arbitrary arrest, detention or exile, fair and public hearing, no arbitrary interference with privacy, right to freedom of movement, right to seek and enjoy asylum, right to a nationality, right to marry and to found a family, right to property, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, right to take part in government, right to work, right to rest and leisure, right to food, clothing, housing, medical care and social services, right to education, right to participate in cultural life.
These human rights are not country-specific. They are not a reward for good behavior or particular to a certain era or social group. They are the rights of people of every color, from every race and ethnic group, whether or not they have disabilities, citizens or migrants, no matter their sex, their class, their caste, their creed, their age, or sexual orientation.
The Declaration has generated action for human rights protection in many ways. It has inspired hundreds of human rights instruments that together constitute international human rights law and a number of international bodies and mechanisms for human rights protection. The principles of the Declaration have supported the decolonization struggle and have been enshrined in the constitutions of the newly established countries which have joined the United Nations. The Declaration has inspired national and regional human rights protection systems, including legislation and institutions, and it continues to guide the work of human rights defenders and advocates worldwide. Today, the Declaration is available in more than 500 languages and dialects, and it has obtained the Guinness World Record for the most translated document in the world. The 10th of December, the day on which the Declaration was adopted, is celebrated each year as Human Rights Day. The Declaration emphasizes the relevance of human rights in our daily lives.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world.
So I kind of want to end off just by talking a bit about where this idea of human rights comes from. And I believe that it comes from this basic idea in our faith, and in many other faiths, that God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. You know, we believe that all people are created in God's image and likeness, that they have this dignity that means that we should care about them. And the first half of the 20th century, we saw so many of kind of the examples of where we didn't see that, you know, in the treatment of Indigenous Canadians in the residential schools, but also overseas, as thousands and thousands of people killed others and, you know, tore the world apart in the First World War, and during kind of with these terrible dictators that took over many countries during the Second World War. But we also saw people who powerfully understood that human beings were important, that their lives were valuable and sacred. You know, and we can be grateful for those people who saw that and who gave us this understanding that it's so important to understand human dignity and to learn from the things that happened in our history. So I'm going to leave us off there. Next week, we're going to pick up with how Canada changed after World War II and go basically from then till the present day. So thank you for listening. Bye-bye.